Before we begin, let me ask you something personal. Have you ever felt that a place remembered something about you, even when you had never been there before? A quiet sense that the walls were aware, that the air was waiting. If that feeling is familiar, then stay with me. These stories are real. The people existed. The events were recorded, witnessed, argued over, and left unresolved. And once you hear them, it becomes difficult to forget how close fear can be. Chapter 1. Possession of Clarita Villanueva. Clarita Villanueva was 12 years old when fear learned how to speak her name. She was small for her age, thinner than most children, her ribs faintly visible beneath her worn dress, her eyes trained downward as if the floor was safer than the world above it. In 1953, Manila was crowded and unforgiving, full of noise, hunger, and people trying to survive one day at a time. And children like Clarita learned quickly how to disappear. When she was accused of stealing a few coins, no one asked why. No one searched for her parents. No one questioned whether a child should be frightened. An officer took her by the wrist and led her through iron gates that closed with a sound she would never forget. Bilibid prison did not welcome her. It swallowed her. Her cell was narrow and damp, concrete walls darkened by age and moisture, the air heavy with rust, sweat, and something sour that settled into her lungs. During the day, she sat quietly with her knees pulled to her chest, listening to the prison breathe around her. Voices echoed through corridors she could not see. Footsteps passed and faded. Metal scraped against metal, and sometimes men shouted in pain or anger. Clarita did not cry then. She waited. At night, the prison changed its tone. The noise thinned until silence filled the spaces between walls. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that felt intentional. Clarita noticed how even her breathing sounded loud. She lay awake on the cold floor, staring at darkness, her thoughts moving in circles until exhaustion finally pulled her under. That was when she heard the footsteps. They were slow, measured, and wrong. Not like the guard's boots, not rushed or careless, but careful, deliberate. They stopped directly in front of her cell. Clarita waited for keys to jingle, for a voice to speak, for a cough or sigh, or any sign of another human presence. Nothing came. The silence that followed felt heavy, pressing against her ears, as if whatever stood there was listening to her breathe. Clarita whispered a greeting, her voice thin and trembling. There was no reply. Eventually, sleep took her, shallow and broken. The second night, she woke to pressure. Cold fingers pressed into her arms and shoulders, pinning her down before she could move. Her body froze, her mind lagging behind the sensation, and then pain exploded through her arm as teeth sank into her flesh. Clarita screamed, the sound tearing out of her chest as if pulled free. The pain was sharp and sudden, followed by a burning ache that made her sob. Guards came running. They found her curled against the wall, shaking, blood running down her arm. Fresh bite marks were visible, swollen and deep, human in shape. The cell was empty. The door had remained locked. No one else had been inside. They told her she must have bitten herself. Clarita shook her head until it hurt. The third night, it happened again. Sometimes the pain came from her arms, sometimes her shoulders, sometimes her neck. Sometimes she was asleep when it began, waking only to the agony.
Sometimes she was awake and waiting, heart racing, breath shallow. The marks appeared quickly, teeth impressions rising beneath unbroken skin, followed by blood moments later. Doctors were called. They examined her mouth, her jaw, her hands. They restrained her arms. Still the wounds appeared. Clarita began to speak about what she saw. She said there were figures in the cell with her, small and dark, heavier than shadows, close enough that she could feel their breath. She said they hated silence and waited for the prison to sleep before coming closer. Some guards refused to walk her corridor at night. Others mocked her, calling her cursed. Journalists arrived, then priests, then doctors, then skeptics wanted to prove her wrong. Each night brought witnesses, and still the attacks continued. They watched as her skin broke without touch, as bite marks formed while her arms were held, while men stood inches away.
Pastor Lester Sumrall was one of them. He stood inside the cell with Clarita, holding her wrists firmly, surrounded by guards and medical staff. Clarita was crying softly, whispering prayers she barely remembered, her eyes fixed on the corners of the room. Then she screamed. Beneath his hands, her muscles tensed, and when they looked down, fresh bite marks were already visible, teeth impressions rising as if pressed from the inside out. No one had moved. No one had touched her. Clarita said they were angry. She said they whispered words she could not understand, words that made her head ache, words that felt old and heavy. She said they told her the prison had opened something, and that she belonged to it now. The attacks came without pattern. Days of quiet would pass, then sudden violence would return. Doctors noted that the wounds healed unusually fast, leaving faint scars that faded within weeks. Psychologists argued hysteria. Others accused her of deception. None could explain how the wounds appeared while she was being watched. Clarita stopped sleeping. She sat awake through the nights, flinching at every sound, begging guards to stay nearby. She said when people were close, the figures stayed back, watching, waiting. She said they smiled in the dark. After weeks, Clarita was released from prison. The attacks stopped immediately. No new marks ever appeared. Clarita disappeared into adulthood, her name fading into records and whispered conversations among those who had witnessed the impossible. Bilibid Prison remained unchanged, its walls holding memories they would never release. Even years later, guards spoke quietly about certain cells where the air felt heavier, where footsteps echoed without source, where silence felt watched. Some places remember what happens inside them, and some children leave pieces of their fear behind forever.
Chapter 2. The Smurl Family Haunting. The house on Chase Street looked like a promise. 2 stories, pale siding, a narrow porch that caught the afternoon light, windows that reflected the neighborhood back at itself, ordinary in a way that felt comforting. Jack Smurl noticed that first, how nothing about the place warned him. He took it as a sign. After years of moving, of making do, of telling his family that things would settle soon, he wanted a house that felt quiet. Janet wanted the same thing. Their children ran through the rooms on the first day, voices bouncing off bare walls, laughter filling spaces that felt empty but hopeful. For a while, the house behaved. Mornings passed normally. Evenings were calm. The sounds they heard at night were the sounds people expect: pipes clicking, floorboards adjusting, wind brushing the siding. They told themselves that old houses talked sometimes. Everyone knew that. The first sound that did not belong came late. It was a dull thump from inside the wall behind the living room couch, slow and deliberate, followed by a pause, then another. Jack stood up and pressed his ear to the wall. The sound stopped. He waited, listening to the quiet stretch out, then sat back down. When the thump returned, it came from higher up, as if something inside the wall had moved. They told themselves it was nothing. The smell came next. It drifted through the house without warning, thick and sharp, like sulfur and burning air mixed together. It made Janet gag. Windows were opened, doors checked, appliances inspected. There was no source. The smell vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind a faint nausea and the sense that something had passed through the rooms. The children noticed before the adults admitted it. They complained about whispers at night, about hearing their names spoken softly from hallways that were empty. Janet brushed it off, told them dreams could sound real, told them houses creaked. Jack wanted to believe her. He worked long hours and slept deeply. At least, he used to. The first time he felt it, he thought he was waking from a nightmare. The bed dipped beside him, slowly, as if someone had sat down. The weight pressed into the mattress. Jack opened his eyes and saw nothing. The room was dark, quiet, still. He told himself it was his imagination and rolled onto his side. The pressure remained for several seconds, then lifted. He did not sleep after that. Janet felt it too, though she did not say anything at first. Hands pressing against her back when she lay awake, fingers brushing her hair when she was alone in the kitchen, a presence close enough to feel but never see. She started leaving lights on at night. She said it was for the children. Objects began to move. A lamp slid off a table and shattered without being touched. A chair tipped over in an empty room. The television switched itself on at exactly the same time each night, filling the living room with static that felt louder than it should have been. When Jack unplugged it, the screen flickered anyway. The house learned their routines. It waited until they were tired. The whispers grew louder, clearer. Words formed beneath the hum of silence, mocking prayers, repeating conversations the family had only spoken behind closed doors. The children stopped sleeping in their own rooms. They dragged blankets onto the floor of the parents' bedroom, pressing close together, afraid to be alone with the dark. The growling started after that. Low animal sounds echoed through the hallways at night, vibrating through the walls, rising and falling as if circling the rooms. Jack grabbed a flashlight and searched the house more than once, checking closets, opening doors, calling out. He never found anything, but he felt watched the entire time. The first physical attack came without warning. Jack was walking down the stairs when something shoved him from behind. He fell hard, tumbling down several steps before landing in a heap at the bottom. Janet ran to him, terrified, asking who had done it. Jack could only shake his head. No one had been there. He knew the difference between losing his balance and being pushed. After that, the house stopped pretending. Voices shouted instead of whispered. Laughter echoed from empty rooms. Once, a black figure stood at the end of the hallway, tall and featureless, absorbing the light around it. Jack froze, heart pounding, unable to move. When he blinked, it was gone.
The children began to scream in their sleep.
They described nightmares that felt too detailed, too consistent. A presence that watched them, that stood in corners and smiled without a face. Janet found scratches on one child's arm one morning. The child swore she had not done it herself. Priests came and prayed. The house responded with louder noises, with bangs that shook the walls, with voices that mocked the prayers word for word. Holy water dried into dark stains on the floor. Crosses fell from walls without explanation. Investigators arrived, including Ed and Lorraine Warren. They recorded voices on tape that no one present had spoken. Low snarls layered beneath silence, words that made the hair on Janet's arms rise. They felt cold spots in rooms that had no drafts. They felt pressure in the air, a heaviness that settled into the chest and refused to lift. Skeptics accused the family of lying. They said stress could do strange things, that attention fed delusions, that fear was contagious. Jack listened to them and felt anger rise in his throat. Fear did not throw furniture across rooms. Fear did not leave bruises. Fear did not watch you sleep. The family stayed because they had no choice. Leaving was expensive. Starting over was impossible. The house knew this. The activity intensified, as if feeding on exhaustion. The smell returned more often. The growls grew closer. Sometimes the voices mimicked the children perfectly, calling Janet from empty rooms in tones she could not ignore. Years passed. The family learned how to live around the terror, how to avoid certain rooms, how to speak softly at night, how to sleep with lights on. Fear became routine. That was the cruelest part. The house did not want them gone. It wanted them tired. Eventually, they left. The house was sold. New families moved in, hopeful, unaware. None stayed long. Neighbors reported lights turning on in empty rooms, footsteps on the stairs at night, shadows moving behind curtains when no one lived there. The house on Chase Street still stands. It does not scream. It waits. And sometimes, if the night is quiet enough, it whispers. Chapter 3. Black Hope Cemetery. The neighborhood was supposed to be a fresh start. Clean streets stretched beneath new streetlights, sidewalks uncracked and pale, houses identical in their quiet confidence, lawns trimmed to perfection, the kind of place where evenings felt slow and safe. Families moved into Black Hope, believing they had found stability, believing the land beneath their homes was solid and honest. Children rode bicycles in wide circles. Parents stood in driveways and talked about schools and fences and futures. No one spoke about what had been there before, because no one had told them. The first sign came during construction, long before the families arrived. Workers digging foundations uncovered bones, pale and fragile, resting just beneath the soil. At first, they thought they were animal remains. Then they found more and more. Skulls, coffin nails, fragments of rotted wood shaped too carefully to be anything else. A supervisor made a call. Another man came and looked. The workers were told to rebury what they found and keep moving. The schedule mattered more than questions. The houses went up quickly after that. Concrete covered the ground where names had once been carved into stone. Grass grew over places where people had been lowered into the earth with grieving hands. The cemetery was old, poorly documented, forgotten by records and memory alike. Black Hope rose over it without ceremony. The families arrived. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Boxes were unpacked, curtains were hung, new furniture filled empty rooms. The houses smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. But some residents noticed small things they could not explain. Cold spots in hallways that never warmed, a sense of pressure in certain rooms, as if the air resisted movement.
children who refused to sleep alone without being able to explain why. The dreams began quietly. Children woke crying, unable to remember what had frightened them, only that something had been close. Parents brushed it off as adjustment, new homes, unfamiliar sounds. Adults had trouble sleeping too, though they did not admit it as easily. They woke in the night feeling watched, certain they had heard footsteps moving through rooms that were empty.
The first footprints were discovered after a storm. Mud tracked across a living room floor, leading from the back door down the hallway and stopping at a child's bedroom. The door had been locked. The window was closed. No one could explain how the prints had appeared. They were wiped away, laughed off, blamed on imagination. They returned weeks later. The sounds followed. Footsteps in attics with no access points, slow pacing above ceilings, stopping directly over beds. Furniture shifted overnight. Chairs moved. Doors opened and closed on their own. One family reported hearing soft humming coming from inside the walls, low and tuneless, like someone trying to remember a melody. Pets reacted before people did. Dogs refused to enter certain rooms, growling at empty corners, hair raised along their backs. Cats stared at spaces above the floor, tracking movement no one else could see. Birds became restless at night, fluttering wildly in cages until covered. Then came the sightings. A woman standing in a hallway late at night, dressed in old clothing, her outline faint but unmistakable. When approached, she vanished without sound. Another resident saw a man sitting at the foot of the bed, head bowed, hands folded, disappearing when the light was turned on. These encounters were brief, silent, and left behind a feeling of deep unease rather than panic. The illnesses started slowly. A neighbor developed a sudden aggressive cancer. Another followed, then another. People who had been healthy deteriorated quickly. Doctors offered explanations that sounded reasonable, but did not quiet the fear spreading through the neighborhood. Parents whispered to each other. Patterns were noticed, symptoms discussed. A sense of wrongness settled in. The ground itself seemed unsettled. Residents reported hearing knocking from beneath their floors, slow and rhythmic, as if something below was trying to answer something above. Pipes were checked, foundations inspected. Nothing explained the sound. At night, the knocking felt closer. One family dug into their backyard to plant a tree. They uncovered a coffin lid. That was when the truth surfaced. A local historian was contacted. Records were searched. Old maps were unfolded and compared. The land sat on top of a cemetery dating back generations. Graves poorly marked, boundaries forgotten. The land had never been cleared properly. Hundreds of people had been buried there. Their names were lost, their resting place erased. The residents demanded answers. Exhumations began. Graves were opened, caskets removed. Remains were relocated with care this time, documented and reburied elsewhere. News crews filmed the process. Officials promised closure. Some families felt relief watching the ground disturbed, believing the activity would stop once the dead were moved. But not all graves were found. Some records were missing. Some burials had never been marked. Others had collapsed over time, leaving no trace. The land had shifted. The past had sunk too deep. Even after the exhumations, the activity continued.
Footsteps still echoed at night, voices whispered through hallways, children still woke crying. The pressure in certain rooms never lifted. One family moved out within weeks, another followed. Houses went up for sale more often than expected. New owners arrived with hope and left with fear. Residents who stayed spoke quietly. They said the land felt crowded. They said sleep came with difficulty. They said sometimes, late at night, they heard voices beneath the floor, not angry, not violent, just present, as if reminding the living they were not alone. Black hope remains. The streets are still clean. The houses still stand. Children still play during the day, but at night the neighborhood changes. Silence settles heavier there than elsewhere, and those who live above the forgotten graves learn something no one warned them about. The dead do not always rest when they are built over. Sometimes they stay, and sometimes they wait.